Welcome to the Philos Project Podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and this week I have the honor of speaking with Jesse Tannetta. He is an educator with the Anti-Defamation League, another incredible organization in the space that monitors anti-Semitism and educates against anti-Semitism and on the Holocaust. Me and Jesse discuss the rise in anti-Semitism, particularly in the form of Holocaust denial, both, of course, on the left, but alarmingly on the right. In a recent video uploaded by Candace Owens on her YouTube channel, she peddles some dangerous ahistorical information, essentially arguing that Hitler was not the most evil man of the 20th century. There was other more evil atrocities post-World War II, and therefore the Holocaust, or our fixation on the Holocaust, the Jews and the Nazis here in the West, simply must just be more evidence of a larger Jewish conspiracy in the United States and in our education system. This type of anti-Semitism is becoming more and more prevalent. It's dangerous, it's ahistorical, and it manipulates history to paint an anti-Semitic political agenda. This conversation is important. It's one we have to educate our children on, and we must never forget. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Jesse, thank you so much for joining me on the Philos Project Podcast. Could you give us a quick introduction on who you are and what you do in your educational background?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Jesse Tannetta. I'm the Director of Holocaust Content and Pedagogy at Echoes and Reflections, which is a Holocaust education program throughout the country. I mostly work on the content and the writing of it. One of our partners in this program is the Anti-Defamation League. So, really talking about to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. And I also have a background in Catholic theology. I taught at a Catholic school for many years, and so I'm really excited to talk to you about history today, Holocaust history, and also, Christianity and its many mistakes as well in terms of its relationship with Jewish people. So it's going to be fun. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And today we're really going to be responding to a video Candace Owens made about a month ago, kind of spinning the Holocaust, suggesting that Hitler wasn't the most evil person of the 20th century. And she's popularizing something on the conservative and maybe religious right, which is not denying the Holocaust overtly, but underplaying the severity of it, which I think is just as dangerous as overt Holocaust denial as maybe someone like Nick Fuentes on the conservative, maybe far extreme political and religious right. So maybe from the top, what are your observations on maybe the popularizing opinions or narratives surrounding the Holocaust and even just American Jewry today? I think it's really escalated in a post-October 7 world.
Yeah, if we want to just start with Holocaust denial is just another form of anti-Semitism. And so we have to kind of ask the big question of, like, why would someone deny or distort the history of the Holocaust? What's the point of that? This is the most documented genocide of all time. And it's really about anti-Semitism. And when we think about denial doesn't begin with Nick Fuentes or Candace Owens today or 30 years ago. Denial started with Nazis literally seeking to hide the crimes that they had committed. So that could be destroying evidence, blowing up gas chambers and crematoria, or even having veiled euphemisms for murder like resettlement to the east. And so if we think about denial, we have to think about, well, if it didn't happen, who has to be wrong? Well, certainly the victims have to be wrong. The bystanders, the people that were there, have to be wrong. American soldiers that liberated camps would have to be wrong, as well as the perpetrators who do not deny what they did, but often use the argument or excuse that they were just following orders, which is what we see from Adolf Eichmann in his trial in 1961 and others in post-war trials. And so if we think about the kind of phenomenon of denial today, and you mentioned October 7th, immediately people were denying the horrible massacre by Hamas in Israel. But why are we seeing it? And we see it because of that just systemic, latent, and now sometimes just overt anti-Semitism that's existing and exploding in our world today. There aren't too many people, rational people, that are denying the Holocaust happened, but they want to deny certain aspects. They want to downplay it, whether that's saying there weren't really gas chambers or, medical experiments. We're going to talk a lot about whataboutism today, about, well, that was bad, but this was also bad. And we see it more in that distortion, saying that these things didn't happen or comparing it to other atrocities, or, even we see it in trivialization today as well. I'm thinking of like the COVID vaccine stars that just were obvious Jewish statements, that play on the anti-Semitism that exists in our society. And it's really dangerous. And it's also just this cheap, effective tool that just starts to build anti-Semitism, waiting for that spark, that explosion, that it can, really just terrorize our society, and obviously terrorize Jews throughout the world, as we're seeing, really in the last 8 months, 9 months.
I want to get your take on a few of Candace's statements, because I think it's emblematic of what you're talking about of, oh, yeah, the Holocaust happened, but it wasn't that bad. Or if you compare it to other atrocities of World War II, it was just another one. And I think what we're going to talk about today is the Holocaust was a distinct evil. So I'm going to play this first clip where she's talking about how Hitler was essentially not that bad.
When you assume that people, therefore, must know a lot about World War II, you then find out that actually Americans know nothing about World War II. My husband was amazed by this, by the way, obviously, because I'm in this sort of cross-national relationship. My husband was like, why do Americans always use Adolf Hitler as if, he was the number one mass murderer of the 20th century? He wasn't. What is this extreme focus on Nazis and Adolf Hitler as the only comparison we can ever make? And
so she essentially makes a claim that we've been indoctrinated to think that Hitler is like the epitome of evil. And she goes on, and we'll look at some other clips to say that other really horrible things happen. But can you explain to us what distinctly made Hitler evil during World War II in a way that was different from maybe actors of the conventional war front?
Yeah, so if we think about the history of the Holocaust and what actually happened, I think the first statement that I want to make is like, let's be clear that we're not playing the misery Olympics, or I think that, that's what we like to call it, of like, we're not comparing terrible things. Just because the Soviets or the Americans or insert country here has done also terrible things doesn't make the Nazis less bad or less evil, or somehow excuse their atrocities, right? And so when we think about the Holocaust, kind of three main points. One, that this is unprecedented genocide. It's total, it's systematic, it spans nearly the entire continent of Europe. It includes North Africa, the Middle East, it includes Scandinavian countries. And there was a clear plan and ambition and desire to murder every single Jewish person on earth. Its scale, both in terms of that victim, just count and number and people, and also the scale of perpetrators, right? The Nazis are not going to succeed. They may be the main drivers, but without the help of the average German, Austrian, French, Norwegian, North African, Polish, Ukrainian, Belarusian, you get the idea, right? That there are millions of people that support this plan of annihilation. We're also talking about a Jewish population in Europe of about 9 million at the time in the 1930s, where 2% of the population, and by 1945, we know the number is 6 million are murdered, but that is 2 of every 3 Jewish person in Europe, on the European continent, is murdered. This includes entire families, communities. We're talking about people and communities that had lived and existed in places for thousands of years, with their culture, their traditions, their assimilation into society in places, their contributions. And so this is just the scale is overwhelming to understand. And I think there's also the shock of the Holocaust, right? This is the first industrial genocide that utilized technology. So there's this morbidity, there's this horrifying realization of what human beings can do to one another. And I think the long history of anti-Semitism is also something that, doesn't end after the Nazis. It didn't begin with the Nazis. And so this is also a genocide that we continually have to talk about and learn from, because it can absolutely happen again as we see anti-Semitism rising. And so, like, all of those things make this a really unique genocide, and one that, is something that we must learn from. And if we don't, it'll absolutely happen again.
Mm. And I'm going to play a clip in a second where Candace makes a claim that the U.S. ethnically cleansed 12 million Germans after World War II ended. And therefore, in comparison, the numbers is nothing compared to what happened in the Holocaust with the Jews. But I think what's important to also point out is the Jewish European Jewry were targeted for annihilation because of their Jewish identity. It wasn't because of their national identity. So in the conventional war front, civilians, unfortunately, were a casualty of war. So it was a total war, World War II. But typically that would have been because of their national identity, whether they were German or the Blitz in England and they were British. The Jewish population in Europe was targeted because they committed the crime of just being born Jewish, which is incredibly horrific. So this is another kind of form, I think, of Holocaust denial that's becoming popular, which is, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, on the right, there seems to be this growing narrative post October 7 as a reaction, favoring maybe more isolationist foreign policy, to claim that there's a ring of Jews in DC and Hollywood that control our politics, that slant our politics towards favoring Israel. And Candace seems to extend that kind of train of thought into our education system and essentially claims that we fixate on the Holocaust because there's some sort of propaganda or bent to focus on the Jews and what was committed against them by the Nazis. And this is a clip where she states that.
When I actually then started learning real history and I got out of the bubble of the American education system and I started recognizing these Soviet tactics of introducing really heavy concepts to kids while their brains are developing because you want to traumatize them. And you're traumatizing them because you want them to comply. And what you want them to comply with in this case is Germany, Nazi, Hitler, the greatest evil that's ever happened on earth, even though factually and statistically it is not. And part of that learning.
She's making an interesting claim. And she's used the idea that somehow the Jews are tied to the Soviets, which interestingly enough, and you would be the expert in this, pretty sure Hitler and the Nazis also tried to liken the Jews with their Soviet enemies in World War II or in the lead up to World War II. So historically, her argument is interesting because it feels all too similar from maybe some of those popular narratives in the interwar years. But also, I just think she's factually incorrect at a larger level to maybe argue that this is some sort of way to get our youth to comply with the idea that Hitler was a unique evil. So what are your kind of thoughts to this bizarre argument?
Yeah, I have kind of two that are larger about what the point of studying history is. And Candace does not understand this, or she doesn't, say what this is about, that she doesn't understand the point of learning history. It's not about placing blame. It's not about trying to make someone feel bad or knowing the evil actions of the past. It's not about knowledge necessarily, about statistics or numbers or facts. It's about learning about the people in the past to understand what happened, why it happened, and how it happened, so we can inform us to try and understand human nature, human society, that we can make better decisions today, and also to build a better future for ourselves and the society as a whole. And I think we see this in many southern states with their divisive concepts, laws, and their, what amounts to censorship of we can't teach anything that makes people feel bad. And that's not the point of learning history. The point of learning history is to understand the past so that we can learn how to make better decisions today and in the future. And instead, what she's doing is what I call whataboutism, that she wants to talk about everything. Let's talk about every evil thing that's ever happened, and we'll just compare them by numbers or statistics or, again, that misery Olympics idea. And so we're never talking about one thing. Let's talk about one thing and discuss it, right? This is an issue. Let's talk about it. What are some solutions? What can we do here? And also, for someone that, is listening for anti-Semitism, because that's what I do every day, this just reeks of the anti-Semitism that I'm talking about. If you think that there are people inside our government that control the government, if you think there are people that are controlling the banks, if you think there are people behind the scenes controlling the weather, or you think the earth is flat, you will eventually come to hate Jews, because the classic anti-Semitic tropes of Jews controlling the banks, Jews controlling governments, that is just seeped and is at the core of everything that she's talking about. And so, for the average person, like, oh, well, I do want to look at my government. My government has done evil things. I really need to learn this history. Like, that's all true. But the point is to understand it for today and for the future. And if you think that there are evil actors within that are controlling it, you will eventually hate Jews. And so these are all just coded words and dog whistles that really mean Jews. And so, you mentioned Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes just comes out and says Jews are doing this, right? And so hopefully the majority of us can look at that and say, no, like that guy is really out there on the extreme right. But then we have this kind of dangerous rhetoric that has become normalized, and people are not calling it out what it is, which is coded dog whistles that mean Jews. Jews are doing this, and so it's really dangerous, and it's certainly disingenuous as well.
Mm-hmm. I want to play one more because I think it goes to what you're talking about, this kind of coded anti-Semitism. Although I think when you watch this video, and I encourage all the listeners to watch it, it becomes more overt as you go on in her monologue. But here's this last clip.
It was coming across a huge fact that we ethnically, the Allies, ethnically cleansed 12 million Germans. Because when you say people, okay, what is it about Hitler? Why is he the most evil? Well, the first thing people would say is, well, an ethnic cleansing almost took place. And now I offer back, you mean like we actually did to the Germans? Here's a clip again from that documentary I keep telling you that you have to watch. It premiered on BBC, and it is entitled The Savage Peace.
So the first thing, and I'm sure you probably picked up on this right away, is, and it's also the delivery. So it's not just what she says, not to dissect her too much as a personality, but she, like the supposed ethnic cleansing, like it's almost condescending in how she's talking. So first, there was not an ethnic cleansing against European Jewry. There was a genocide. So there's a important distinction in definitions. And she also uses the term supposed. So she essentially is implying that it didn't actually happen. But on that same note, we did commit an ethnic cleansing against Germans in a post-World War II Europe. So yeah, what are your thoughts kind of just off the top of what she said? And there's also some then historical, I think, fallacies, or she's kind of spinning this in a way that's a little dangerous too.
Yeah, thank you so much for the genocide versus ethnic cleansing. And it's difficult because when we look at the definition of genocide, and if we think of the UN definition that is agreed upon, and so it's obviously political in nature because countries had to agree with it and it went through the UN and all of that. But also that there are it's a clear definition. So we just look at it and you did it or you didn't do it. And so it's very clear the Germans and the Nazis sought to commit genocide against Jews, and that was clear. She is correct in her history that, millions of Germans are moved from their houses and ethnically cleansed back to Germany after World War II. Now, this is largely in the Soviet Union, what becomes basically the Soviet bloc. Many of those Germans had lived there for decades or hundreds of years. Many of them had been moved there by the Nazis to colonize Ukraine, Poland, and that aspect, right? So, there's a little bit of history there. So, this is a classic tactic by denialists and distortionists, is to take a little piece of history and then, like you said, you suppose it, take this, aspect of history that's really terrible, and then, try to make a whataboutism that this was worse or this was different, or in that aspect of it. And that's what she's doing here, right? And so there's a little bit of facts here. And the delivery and the approach to it is really disingenuous again, and that whataboutism. So now we're not talking about the Holocaust. Now we're comparing what happens after the war in a total society that had collapsed, right? And we're not just talking about German society, basically turned to rubble, both in terms of just infrastructure and also just their society in general. We're also just talking about an entire continent that is just practically destroyed, right? And if it's not for the Marshall Plan later on, and really the Cold War at least gets Western Europe, revitalized because of the United States funding of rebuilding that society. And I guess this is the kind of last point that I'll put, is that she is talking so much about vacuums, right? That this is only happening in a vacuum, and there's no other, things going on in the world, that the war ends and then we start the next chapter, where that's not the case, right? That everything doesn't happen in a vacuum, that there are so many other things going on, that there's the impending Cold War, the dividing up of territory, there's post-war trials, there's funding, there's internal struggles, there's exhausted American soldiers and a population that is tired of war. There's so much else going on, but she just wants to put everything in a vacuum and just say that this wasn't as bad because this was also bad. in some way that the Nazis are somehow less bad because of what happened later or what happened when someone else did something.
Mm. I think cornerstone to the genocide definition is pointing to intention. And the Germans obviously had a bent intention to, even towards the end of the war, when they were losing the conventional war, to still put their resources to the death camps and the industrialized death camps that they were still building out up until the very end. And as you mentioned, what she's pointing to is the unfortunate and horrific atrocities, and not to take away from, those horrific events of a society that was involved in a total war front, and there was lone actors who committed horrible atrocities. There was governments who committed horrible atrocities, but they are distinctly different. And I think that's important just to touch on. And as you mentioned in the opening remarks, was that's just a way to read history, and that's why history is so important. So maybe we could just take it back a little bit. So zooming out from Candace Owens, or we mentioned Nick Fuentes, what is the history of Holocaust denial? So you even mentioned, right when World War II was ending and the Allies were liberating the camps, immediately this campaign of denial starts. So what is the history of that, and how have people on both sides of the political aisle used Holocaust denial for their own aims?
Yeah. I mean, again, like I said, it starts right away with the Nazis. It's a classic trope in German society of I didn't know. We have Eisenhower, who is in Ohrdruf, the concentration camp, liberates it, and immediately, reaches out to the United States, asks for senators, asks for congresspeople, asks for journalists to come. Um, they literally bring townspeople that are around these camps, and some of them I've been fortunate enough to go to, that the towns are right there. They're, right next door. They're parking their cars next to a death camp and taking the same train lines to go to work, kind of thing. Like a horrifying experience. Bringing people there to help bury the dead and to see what German society had committed. And even with all of that information, with trials and documentation and museums and memorials and all of this kind of aspects of it, we never deal with the problem of anti-Semitism, right? And again, just as people, there's a whole denazification process, but, the Nazis are no longer the enemy in 1945. It's the Soviets, right? And so there's not a lot of gusto or desire to bring about justice. Some justice is done, most of it is not, and that part of denial starts right away from the average German saying, "Well, I didn't know," and then it's really unpopular to deny the Holocaust in the first kind of 20 years after it, right? Just like anti-Semitism was really persona non grata. We don't want to talk about it. Like, Nazis are bad, and like that's very clear. And this starts to change as we get further from the history, right? As other things happen in the world, as people die, as survivors pass away, this denial, starts to bubble up again. And again, this is just another form of anti-Semitism. It really starts to build from the Soviet Union in the 60s and the 70s as Israel becomes a focal point in its wars against its neighbors in the Arab world. And it starts slowly, right? It starts with things like, the Israel only exists because of the Holocaust. We gave them a state just to, get them away and quell their, as a pity present, right? And obviously that turns into the anti-Semitic trope that Jews made up the Holocaust to get their own country. And so we start to see those seeds of denial. And then as anti-Semitism rises, and especially, in the United States, we see it, coming from the left and in, some of the liberation movements, the extreme left side of some of the liberation movements, thinking that Jews are, holding people of color back in the civil rights movement. Obviously, we see it in the right as anti-Semitism is the engine and the fuel of the white supremacist movement that builds in the 80s and the 90s. And so denial just becomes another tool, another weapon, another, disgusting tactic to hate Jews. If we can say it didn't happen, if we can say that it wasn't as bad, or, thinking about what Candace said about, lots of people die in war, right? It is as Americans, especially in living memory, we don't have that living memory, right? We're over 150 years from the Civil War, right? And so the only memory we have of civilian deaths, is too old for us to really remember, right? We're thinking Civil War is the last time that we can talk about civilian deaths, really, as even Pearl Harbor is largely a military attack against us. And so we look at these numbers and we don't understand war in our own national consciousness of civilians die in war. It's tragic, it's horrible, but that happens. And so there's this kind of just engine that goes. And as we get farther away, it wasn't intentional. Everyone was dying from war. They weren't the only ones to put people in camps, right? We know about American incarceration of Japanese. The British are doing the same to Germans in Britain. So, camps are bad. It's tough. It was the war. There was no food, and so we slowly start to chip away at the facts of, why this was, an intended genocide against Jews. And then it becomes this, right? And so you have some people on the extreme circles that want to deny everything and really push it. But then we have it in just your, what we would call the average person, right? That are within kind of the central-ish part of the political spectrum who are peddling in dog whistles and coded words for Jews that they're getting from the extreme, and they're just making it a little bit more palatable so they can come on TV, and not be, slammed for something that is clearly anti-Semitic.
I think it's those people who sit in the maybe more palatable arena that are the most dangerous, because we can identify, I think, easily, maybe you're a layperson, someone who's being like a Nick Fuentes, like overtly hateful and anti-Semitic, but it's popularizing maybe those ancient tropes that your average person doesn't know is an ancient trope against the Jews, that then becomes normalized. And then it paves the way for complicit societies when a Hitler personality comes to power. Can you talk maybe about, too, when I look back on the interwar years, I see a society that was, Hitler rose to power because there was economic turmoil. The German people were divided. They were living in just a completely destroyed society after World War I. So they were really ripe for maybe the radical ideas of Hitler. But I look at our society here in the United States that's obviously divided. It looks different than, a war-torn Germany, but I think we're polarizing at a scary rate, and anti-Semitism is a common thread on both sides of the political aisle. Can you maybe talk about some of the similarities between our society now and the interwar years prior to the Holocaust?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in America, we're a little bit lucky because we have a long history of democracy. And even that, as we say, democracy is fragile, or Churchill, I believe, was the one who said, democracy is the worst political system besides all the other ones we've tried before. And so it's something that requires constant work and protection, and a population that believes in it. And so I think we've been a little bit fortunate that we've protected our democracy for this long, and especially in the last 10 years. But if we look at Germany does not have a long history of being a country or having a democracy, right? Germany as a country is only founded in 1870. They have an emperor that, was defeated in World War I. We see World War I being this really catastrophic, German defeat that's really embarrassing. Right. I mean, think about what people in America think about the Vietnam War as a defeat, or, and to have that kind of level of embarrassment, but that your entire country was defeated. Right. So on a scale that's much larger. So we have a really fledgling democracy that the German people didn't necessarily want. Right. They had never known democracy. They didn't fight for it. They didn't advocate for it. It was really imposed on them. You have economic distress, caused by that defeat as well. So not only was this political system put upon you, but these harsh reparations that really cripple your economy. And there's also this like pride of Germany, right? Germany is one of the most progressive countries in the world in the 1920s. And it's the history of, Faust and Goethe and, the, German ethnicity, if we're thinking Mozart and Beethoven, although they're Austrian, they're also German. in ethnicity. And so they have this great pride, and yet they are embarrassed and shamed on the world stage. And then you see the rise of paramilitary groups. You see the normalization of political violence as a viable tool. And you see, the minimalization of dangerous actors, right? We know the Hitler story that he, tries to, the beer hall putsch, he tries to overtake, community in Munich, and it fails. In Bavaria area, and he's put in jail, but they don't really take him seriously. He's out of jail in a few years. It's not a big deal. And then in that time, you have the growth of political violence. You have people economically distressed. You have concern about this democracy. Does it work? Should it work? We're not getting what we want out of our government. And you just throw in a little bit of anti-Semitism there, right? Like, how can this great nation lose a war? The stab in the back myth that Jews caused it. And then, again, what I said before, that easy part of why isn't this government working? If it's a democracy, it should be working. And it's like, well, why is it not working? Jews. And then we have this political violence, and, it starts to kind of bubble up from there in the interwar years. And I think that there are a lot of parallels. Again, what's the point of learning history? To try and understand the actions of the past and look at the world today, right? And so we're seeing instability in our country, whether that's the political divide and political instability. We're seeing economic distress, that people are struggling. We had a global pandemic that Americans are still trying to deal with, not only the economics, but just the emotional trauma, the stress of losing family and friends to a virus we couldn't see. That kind of pain. We're seeing increased immigration. We're seeing, the population change from being majority, white to people of many ethnicities and colors, and that kind of fear and uncertainty. And then we throw in anti-Semitism, and it can really explode. And we've seen that from Charlottesville on. We've seen political violence, whether that obviously is the assassination attempt of former President Trump, or the January 6th, or the in the streets, the attack against Speaker Pelosi at the time, her home. And so that political violence is, another one of those really dangerous indicators if we, continue to allow this kind of festering to happen. Because when it explodes, it's almost impossible to put it back in the bottle.
We've talked a lot about maybe the political reasons why anti-Semitism either emerges or what motivates people to engage in Holocaust denial. What are some of the religious reasons? So I know you have that theology background. So even historically, when I think of anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, we obviously had conspiracies of them running the banks, or maybe even starting the bubonic plague, right? Being that historic scapegoat. But I also think about the prevalence of replacement theology or supersessionism being really at the core of that. So maybe if we could just touch really briefly, since I have you here with an expertise in that, what are some of the religious motivations?
I love to say that as long as there's Christianity, there'll be anti-Semitism, which is, a horrifying thing to say as a Christian who, again, believes in history. So to learn of the mistakes and the, horrible actions of the past, which, Christians have plenty of terrible things that were done in the name of Christianity. I think it obviously starts really early. We're thinking about the most famous verse is in Matthew. So Matthew's written, 70 to 90, the year 70 to 90. So we're still in the first century, saying the classic, his blood be on us and on our children, that, for the death of Jesus. And so we get deicide, the death of God, blaming the Jews, and, there really can be no greater, evil action than killing God. And so Jews get equated with the devil. So we have all this devil language, we have, the belief that Jews have horns, and, really that equation of evil. And, the first kind of 18 to 1900 years of Christianity is really about religious anti-Jewish beliefs, right? There's some elements, thinking of the Spanish Inquisition, that, Jews could convert to save themselves, but then they were, held under suspicion, but they would be safe, if they actually converted, right? But these are really kind of, a religious hatred, a religious rivalry. Christianity is a religion of converts, right? We need to convert to Christianity or be born into it. And so there's, just the existence of Jews is a threat, and it questions the validity of Christianity, right? If Christianity is the one true religion, why are these Jews not converting, right? Especially when we think about Jesus being Jewish and being religiously Jewish, and believing in Judaism. And so you talked about supersessionism, even in the way we title our books in Christianity, right? Old and new, right? If we're thinking of testaments. And so then we see throughout, the Middle Ages, you mentioned a few of the famous ones, but, Jews are restricted to where they can live, what jobs they can have, where they can bury their dead. And so they're always on the outskirts of Christian society. And so when something bad happens, it is the Jews that are targeted. And one of the things I wanted to kind of emphasize here to, answer this question is about anti-Semitism being this irrational, illogical hatred. It's not based on facts. It's not supported by evidence. It's just an irrational, illogical hatred. And I always like to tell the story of Jon Snow and the cholera outbreak in Britain. He maps out where people are getting sick from cholera. They maps out where they're getting their water from. He finds out that the water in some of the pumps are getting people sick, so they shut those pumps down. And we are so close in Western society to figuring out that we should not defecate where we drink water. We're so close to eradicating a really dangerous disease that is killing people. And his conclusion is that the Jews poisoned the well. And that starts the expulsion of Jews out of Britain, and it's like we're so close. And so that other aspect of anti-Semitism being that it destroys societies. It makes us not able to solve problems or discuss an issue or learn because we're blinded by this hatred.
Mm-hmm. I think the point you made too about kind of the Jewish community being a sticking point for Christians. And I think, or at least I like to think as a Christian who's in this space, who's educating Christians on, the Hebraic roots of our faith and the brethren we have with our Jewish brothers and sisters, rather than looking at it as an adversary or an enemy to our faith or a challenge to our faith as Christians. It's interesting when you look at the language of the political right today, and those obviously maybe on the outskirts of being more radical, such as Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, they oftentimes will other the Jews and make, Christian interest here in the US and Jewish interest zero sum. And so, we can't possibly propose policy that would benefit both. It's either or. Even Congressman Massey on his interview with Tucker Carlson said something about how he couldn't sign a bill about anti-Semitism in Congress because it would limit Christian free speech. So you see that pitting of Christians against Jews, which is historic, and it's a long history. So I think it's important to also point out for our audience that this isn't a new phenomenon. This is just one more example in a long line of really similar instances or arguments or beliefs, which is just rather unfortunate. I really want to touch on what happened in the Holocaust. Going back to the Candace video, she doesn't really talk about the horrific things that happened. You mentioned the Japanese internment camps here in the United States. She basically says, well, we did the same thing to the Japanese. And so not to undermine, obviously, the emotional trauma, and I'm sure even the physical trauma, and many of these people's livelihoods were taken away. They couldn't work for the duration of the war. There is something uniquely evil about the Nazi, not just work camps, but the death camp aspect of it. And she makes this, I think, startling claim about Joseph Mengele and the angel of death in Auschwitz. So I'd love to see your thoughts on it.
To the experimentation, yes, of course, that's been embedded into our minds. The Nazis experimented on innocent people. Candace, come on, that's the difference. They experimented on twins. I mean, some of the stories, by the way, sound completely absurd. I mean, like the idea they just cut a human up and then sewed them back together. Why would you do that? Literally, even if you're the most evil person in the world, that's a tremendous waste of time and supplies. Just slice a person in half and sew them together. That just sounds like bizarre propaganda. But let's just go with it. Let's say that's actually true.
So this is the part of her video that I said she kind of veers straight into just anti-Semitism that's quite overt. Can you enlighten our audience, like what happened in these death camps? What were some of those atrocities? And we have documentation for all of this, including the experimentation that was done on twins. What did that look like for European Jewry?
Yeah, I want to make a statement that I think that always came through with my students is that whatever you think the Holocaust was, it was far more horrifying and terrifying and terrible than anything that you can imagine. We think about the words from survivors about, this being the end of the earth and the black hole of Nowhereville. And, I think that's really important for us to recognize that, no matter how long it's been, the terrifying nature, the stories, they never they never not shock. They're always more terrifying, and I think that a lot of what we hear we don't hear until much later, or we hear in a conversation because of I'm thinking of one story of a survivor, Vera Schiff, who has since passed away. Lived in Toronto for many years, and she would tell the story of having to kill a child in Theresienstadt in a camp so that the mother could still live. And then we come to find out that she was also performing abortions on pregnant women, as pregnant women were particularly targeted, as we see from genocide heirs, throughout history. And she had not said that in her, public testimony, recorded, but she said it to a friend of mine as she's working on her PhD about maternal health in the camps, right? So, there are a lot of stories that we don't hear about and we don't know about. And you mentioned this, but like so much of the Holocaust, there's just extensive documentation. It's ridiculous for her to say this. The medical experiments, we have doctors' notes and what they were working on as documents. We have victims. We have, Niall Lish, who is a very famous, was a Jewish doctor that worked in Auschwitz and was, survived because he helped Mengele, with this medical work because he was a trained doctor, not just by victims, by the very doctors themselves, photographs, testimonies, legal cases that were brought against doctors. There's an overwhelming amount of evidence. And to just bridge what we were just talking about this religious hatred between Christians and Jews, this starts to change in the 1800s. Jews are now kind of seen with the rise of racial science and eugenics that this looking at human beings as biological, right? And that there's something about Jewish blood or Aryan blood that makes it different, special, unique, or terrible. And so with this kind of, belief or reliance on science, there's a hope that we can figure it out and then breed the best group, right? But the problem is that genetics are not the only indicator, right? There's so much more that goes into a person rather than just their genetics. And so we see a Nazi plan throughout to better their nation and somehow. So if you want blue-eyed children, but they keep coming out green-eyed because you don't understand blue eyes as a recessive gene, well, maybe there's something that I can inject in people's green eyes that'll make them blue. And so there are experiments for that. Or we're in the middle of a war, right? And she talks about cutting someone in half and tying them to stitching them back up. Well, let's talk about the human's ability to withstand gravity, right? If we're talking about planes, right? So there are experiments of innocent Jewish victims and going through these horrible experiments to test the body's ability to withstand gravity or freezing temperatures or water or poisons, right? Injecting different poisons to see how a person will react, right? And one of the things that is frustrating to the Nazis is that it's really hard it's not just genetics to build something that is the perfect human or whatever they thought in their racial science. But it's much easier to get rid of what they would call bad elements in a society, right? And the United States is with this too in eugenics, right? We're castrating prisoners as well at this time. We're sterilizing inmates, right? So can we get rid of the parts of society we don't want? Alcoholics, sex criminals. We're seeing that today, right? The law. I believe one of the southern states, I'm sorry, it just came to about talking about chemically castrating sex criminals in prisons. We're still talking about it in 2024. asocials, or what the Nazis called work shy, or prostitutes, or the handicapped, or as particularly gay men, right? If we can rid our society of these elements, if we can't turn green eyes to blue eyes, we at least won't have, these group of people that are drained to society, right? And so just to talk about twins, specifically, the Nazis saw this as this great medical opportunity to study two genetically identical people. And so, there are horrifying experiments about, does one twin react to the same as another twin? Can we take a liver out of one twin and put it in the other one, right? So thinking about, can we grow body parts for an identical twin? Can we take the stronger person and, basically create a stronger one in some way, right? And we haven't told a lot of stories today, but I want to just tell one, teaching the human story and boiling down these big numbers to people. And maybe one of the most famous Mengele twins is Eva Kor, who passed away a few years ago. She was in Auschwitz with her twin sister Miriam, subject to Dr. Mengele's experiments, has talked about it extensively, has written a book, has done USC Shoah Foundation testimony, and saw firsthand and suffered under Dr. Mengele, and tells a story of, being horribly sick, and just feeling like she needed to survive, because if one twin died, they would immediately murder the other twin and autopsy them both. And her sister Miriam in 1993 died at the age of 59. She died from kidney cancer. Her kidney was developed like a 12-year-old from the medical experiments that were done to her under Dr. Mengele. And so, in 1984, Eva Kor begins Candles, Holocaust Museum in Indiana, where she was from. And Candles itself is an acronym: Children of Auschwitz Nazi Deadly Lab Experiments. They found 122 still living. And so just to even talk about this as like something that didn't happen or propaganda is really just ridiculous. And goes to that, you can, that thing of like, now we're not talking about anti-Semitism. We're talking about, oh, she made some good points about blank, but she was a little bit too far right or too extreme at this time, right? Instead of looking at it and like, well, if someone's saying this, then their agenda is far different than trying to educate the public.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting too, because Candace Owens is like a political personality, is always questioning, like, why are they telling us these things? So I think it's important as listeners of Candace to question, why is she making such an overtly ahistorical argument? I want to correct myself. I said Joseph Mengele. I meant Mengele, before someone corrects me in the comments, because I know that they will. It just didn't roll off the tongue exactly the right way. But I want to also touch on, you mentioned the reasons that they committed these experiments. Some of them were practical, and they were for the conventional war front, trying to understand science and maybe innovate even the human body. And they found out that they couldn't. But she seems to grapple with it in her statement. There was this evil component and aspect to it. There was a sadistic component. I know that even after the Allies liberated the death camps, there was, lampshades in the officers' quarters that were made out of human skin. I've seen documentation of that in multiple Holocaust museums. There was a horrifically evil, sadistic component of it. So Candace is right. It doesn't make sense, but that is one of the mysteries and the reasons the Holocaust is so distinctly different. Can you maybe speak to not the pleasure or the joy that many of these officers might have had in humiliating the Jews, or maybe, I mean, that sounds horrible, but I'm sure there was a component of that as well. But torture, humiliation, even up until death, and then after death with using them and their bodies in horrible ways. What role does that play in the Holocaust and these death camps?
Yeah, it's the full societal collapse that I mentioned, right? And so we see in genocide, and obviously we see in the Holocaust, that human beings, it's difficult for human beings to treat other human beings this horribly. They have to be trained. They have to be be built to think that way. And so we're talking about all of society. We're talking about children's books that come out to talk about the evil Jew. We're talking about hearing this constantly on the radio. In Rwanda, with the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, they gave everyone radios, right? And we see this in Nazi Germany as well, giving out radios. So you hear this propaganda constantly. We're controlling the sources of information. We're only talking about the Jew in this way, and we're dehumanizing them. And then we're putting them in ghettos, or we're putting them in camps where the conditions are horrific, are disgusting, are, just unfathomable to us. And as regular people living in 2024, and really building in that these people are less than human, that they don't deserve any type of dignity. And we hear this in a survivor, a really interesting one. Her last name is hyphenated, but the last part of it is Newman. I can't quite remember, but she was part of a prisoner exchange. She was a German citizen. She was in the Gulag in the Soviet Union, and they actually did a prisoner exchange. But then the Nazis kept her in Ravensbrück, which is a concentration camp north of Berlin, all women's camp, because they didn't trust her because she had Soviet influences. But she was a German citizen, and so she ended up working in the camp office, and having a much better job than Jews would have, and she could speak German and all of that. And she would talk about that was where they trained the female guards. And they said, she said the first day I saw a guard bump into an inmate and it'd say, "Excuse me," and it was like unbelievable to her. And within 3 days, she's beating her with a stick, or carrying out this vicious atrocities. And I think it's also about power, right? Thinking about power dynamics, what it feels like to be more powerful than someone, to what it feels like to always have the upper hand against a population, and then to see that population is less than human means that you have ultimate power over them, right? And that you don't care if they live or die. There's no accountability. Think about political violence that we mentioned, right? There's no accountability. There's no responsibility. It's not your fault if they die, or even you could be praised and promoted for being more vicious, right? So, they really push the limits. If we're thinking the medical experiments of, they don't stop a study because they're worried about an inmate. They say, well, let's push it. Let's see if they can do this, right? Let's see if they can go a little bit further. And it's terrifying. I'm thinking of one other study. It was actually done by the University of Michigan, late in the war, 1942-ish. They wanted to study the effects of starvation and then figure out what was the best way to get someone starving to get healthier and survive. Because they knew that there were people in Europe and they knew about the camps of people starving. And unfortunately, we see a lot of survivors die because once they're liberated, they eat as much as they can and their bodies just can't handle it, right? And so they did a starvation study with volunteers, and they journaled every day. And after 30 days, I believe it was 30 days, I might be wrong about that, they stopped the study because the people's journals were horrifying, right? They're going through psychotic breaks. They're, from a volunteer study on starvation, right? And they stopped the study, which is much different than the Nazis who were thinking like, oh, well, this person survived, 6 Gs of gravitational force. Let's see if they can survive 7, and not caring about them. There's stories of, Dr. Mengele, to bring it back to there and end this long sentence here of, murdering, a dozen twins at a time to do a full autopsy after living through something, right, so long here, or maybe they all recovered from an illness, and then wants to see was their body special that they survived or not, or that kind of thing. So really the sadistic nature about power, about seeing someone as less than human, and also just not having any punishment or care if they die. There's a never-ending supply. That's a horrible way to put it, but there's a never-ending supply of subjects for these medical experiments, and they are, encouraged to do the most extreme.
And this sounds horrific, prefacing that before I even say it, but I think for the Nazis, they viewed the Jewish prisoners as almost lab rats, or in the same way that, scientists might view a lab rat, but because they were so dehumanized to that point. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Mengele had really primitive or maybe little scientific credentials. Wasn't his experiments kind of ascientifical to a certain extent too?
I mean, we're talking about injecting things to change eye color, so I think absolutely. He trains under again, I'm not a super expert on Dr. Mengele, but he trains under an anthropologist who is again like looking to push the envelope. And I think this is something also just part of Nazi society that is dangerous, and something that we have to think about in our own society is that it's not Hitler that's in the camps doing this. It's not you know it's not Hitler sitting around a table determining, how we're going to, murder the Jews in Hungary. It's Hitler setting the policies, talking about his goals, and then empowering people below him to the most extreme element. So whatever your most extreme idea is, you push it. Because that gives you promotions, that gives you more power, that gives you prestige and money, and all the things that come with being part of the oligarchy, part of the ruling society. And so we see this in Nazi society is Hitler says we want to get rid of the Jews, and then the underlings come up with the most extreme examples. And we see this in the medical field as well, of like we're not trying to figure out the best way to stitch from a gun wound. Let's see if we can reattach an entire human being to itself, right? And really pushing that the most extreme example.
Well, bringing this back to today and why this all matters, would you have ever predicted, I mean, because you work in this space, so you have, a pulse for just society and Holocaust denial. We have the benefit of education and hindsight and the slogan, never again after the Holocaust. And yet we're seeing it happen again, less than 2 generations, less than 100 years since the atrocity. Is it October 7th that kind of re-upped this or maybe popularized this? Or has this really been something that you've been educating against at ADL, but is now more prevalent or maybe more mainstream?
Yeah, it's been concerning. ADL has tracked anti-Semitic incidences for 40 years, one by one, and comes out with an audit. Obviously, this year was worse than we've ever seen before, at something like over 8,800 anti-Semitic incidences in the United States alone. But it's something that's been building. The when you asked me the question about Weimar Germany, and here, just like we're hitting all of these steps, right? We're talking about economic distress. When we think about, if we want to back up a little, in the last 25 years, the last 30 years, right? We've seen political violence, we've seen economic distress, we've seen, changes in our society that cause fear and uncertainty, right? We've seen, we've seen a global pandemic that, threw everyone for a loop, right? So we are seeing all of those warning signs. And so, that building of anti-Semitism is latent. It's always in our society. And so it's something that, we've absolutely been seeing for over 10 years. But, it's still shocking when it explodes. And I think that that's something that is just part of life, is that you don't pay attention to it until it explodes, right? So, people weren't paying attention until 2017 in Charlottesville, right? Or they were shocked by Pittsburgh in 2018, right? And I think we're seeing that now with October 7th from largely the extreme left and the political left of, that same anti-Semitism was building in part of that aspect of the political spectrum too. And now they're having their moment of explosion. And I think, one of the things that we need to do is to talk about and to call out people who peddle in these anti-Semitic tropes, especially when they're on our side of the political spectrum, right? And so I think that from 2017 to October 7th, we saw, the political left care a lot about anti-Semitism, as we heard Congress people, presidents, people of influence, really driving anti-Semitism. And now we're seeing it from the other side, right? Now that the left is entrenched in their political firestorm of anti-Semitism, now all of a sudden we're seeing the right care about it. And I think that both of that is, disingenuous. It doesn't actually solve the problem, because, people aren't listening from those from the other side, but they might listen to the people that are similar to them, that are their neighbors, that live next door to them, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think I always maybe anticipated the more radical left's anti-Semitism, just with, critical theory, and neo-Marxism has always, especially in academia, kind of had its moment, or there's political situations that happen that then it kind of peeks its head out and it becomes popularized. But what I was shocked by was not knowing, obviously, I knew that there was a lot of anti-Semitism on the right, but to me, the anti-Semitism on the right isn't a progressive idea. It's not neo-Marxism. It's not moving towards something or this reconstructed vision of society. It's looking really to the past, and it's so ancient and ahistorical that, to be honest, I thought people would see it for what it is, and it's startling to me that they don't, which is why I've really been trying to have a lot of conversations surrounding Candace Owens and the rhetoric that she's been pushing and the ideas that she's been pushing, because I think it's dangerous and it's becoming more and more popular. And if you read her comment sections or Tucker Carlson's comment sections, you'll see these ancient anti-Semitic tropes, religious tropes. And I think, to me, that's the part that is so crazy. We have history to look back on. And I see that's where it's really replaying itself, is in those circles. So I really appreciate you coming on today. This was a great conversation. Can you point my audience to your educational offerings and what ADL does and how they can educate themselves even more?
Yeah, I want to answer two questions actually. I want to just make one more statement based on that, is that when we talked today, which was great, and we called out kind of some of the most overt aspects of anti-Semitism. We talked about Mengele's experiments and her just like outright denial that we would see more extreme. But what we've been seeing from the right, especially in the last 10 years, that Candace does, that Tucker Carlson does, that we've seen, former President Trump and, many of, the pundits, throughout the conservative, movement or political ideology, are just these dog whistles and just this constant naming of people, that for the average person, you would just be like, oh, well, that's an interesting story, or, oh, that's interesting to think about. So whether that's, if we think about the Candace Owens piece, she talks about Solomon Morell and Sidney Gottlieb and talks about their atrocities, right? Or how many times have we heard a Democratic person or opponent be called Soros-backed, or the Soros-backed district attorney? Why are they name dropping these names? All three of those people are Jewish. And that's not a mistake. It's not a mistake that she picked two people that were Jewish to point her audience to look at. And so the big thing is, like, why is she talking about this? Why is this what she decided on her show that has, hundreds of thousands to, she hit over 2 million subscribers on her YouTube channel? Why is she talking about it? She's talking about it because of that deep-seated anti-Semitism that is existing in our society, that is, a rallying call and inciting of her base. For the average person, they're going to look in and see that, Sidney Gottlieb had some horrifying experiments under the CIA in the 1960s. They're going to look at Solomon Morell, being part of the Soviet Union's secret police in the NKVD, and they're going to say, "Oh, she's right about this." But those other elements in her base, in the dog whistles, are playing on that anti-Semitism, and I think that is something that the average listener might not hear, but once you think about it, it lights up. You just hear it and you see it. So I wanted to make that last point. But to
No,
learn
please.
more,
Yeah, great.
yeah, thank you. To learn more, adl.org. You'll see countless resources, from a hate glossary for some of these coded words. We have tools to track hate. The hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, terrorism database is an excellent resource that you can look at your local communities to see what's going on. And countless educational programs from adl.org, whether that is awareness to action, which is for students to learn about anti-Semitism and Jewish identity, and my kind of field of expertise, which is echoes and reflections.org, where all of our stuff is free, open source, online. We're talking lesson plans, a timeline of the Holocaust, where lots of professional development, webinars, online courses coming to school districts, teaching about the Holocaust, teaching about anti-Semitism, teaching about genocide. It's what we do every day, and it's really powerful work, and it's important work, obviously, as anti-Semitism threatens democracies and threatens our society as a whole. So happy to be here, proud to be here, and looking forward to working with Philos a little bit more in the future, I hope.
Yeah, me too. Your work is so important, obviously, as this conversation really highlights, especially for the political moment that we're in. And I love that you guys do a lot of education work for educators. I think it starts with our education system, and the next generation is really honestly a great place to start when talking about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. So thank you so much. And I look forward to having you back. And I encourage everyone to go check out ADL. Thank you so much, Jesse. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Philos Project Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the Holocaust, I encourage you to check out our YouTube channel. We recently posted a lecture taught by the amazing Dr. Whitney Bendick from Florida State University from our recent Pathfinder retreat in Washington, D.C., where she teaches on how the Nazis institutionalized anti-Semitism into law in the inner warriors leading up to World War II. If you would like to take a course on the religious and the cultural roots of anti-Semitism regarding the Christian church, I encourage you to take our Jews, Christians, and the Bible course taught on our Pathfinder Academy by Dr. Gerald McDermott. The Philos Project is a nonprofit, and if you feel led to give to our educational offerings, I will leave a link in the description below. And as always, thank you, and I will see you next week.